Imagine that you are driving along the highway with your family. A brand new SUV, fresh from a car dealership, glitters in the sun. The music is playing, the kids are laughing in the back seat, and suddenly, silence. The engine stops without warning. The speedometer is 70 mag, and multi-ton trucks are speeding along the next lane. The car is losing power, you are shackled by fear, and one word lights up on the dashboard: an error. This scenario has already become a reality for thousands of General Motors car owners across the country. And this is not an accident. Today we will talk about the dark side of GM's legendary V8 engines, the very engines that have held the company's reputation for decades, those that were considered a symbol of American reliability and strength. But what is happening now may destroy this legend completely. GM has announced a massive recall of almost 600,000 pickup trucks and SUVs. The reason is the risk of sudden engine failure right on the move. But there is more to the official press releases. It's not just a malfunction. We are talking about years of omissions, compromises in engineering, and decisions made in the offices of top managers. Decisions that put accountability and fuel economy first, rather than your safety and the lives of your loved ones. How is this possible? How can motors worth tens of thousands of dollars, assembled in modern factories and advertised as a power benchmark, die after a few months of operation? Why, instead of a real solution, does the company offer owners a simple oil change, as if it could cure a fundamental design defect? And most importantly, did GM executives know about this in advance? In this investigation, we'll figure out what's behind the words catastrophic failure. We will show you the testimonies of mechanics who have seen the same damage in dozens of broken engines. We will tell the stories of real people who find themselves on the side of the road with a stalled car for which they paid more than for their own house. We will raise the documents and internal instructions from which it follows. GM management understood that problems were inevitable, but continued to produce cars, hoping that most buyers simply would not have time to face a breakdown before the end of the warranty. This story is not about metal and oil. This is a story about what happens when a company with a century-old history does not prioritize where it should. This is a story about trust that collapses in a matter of months, although it has been built for decades. This is a story about how competitors use the moment to offer disappointed customers an alternative. And if you think it won't affect you personally, think again. Perhaps right now a car is driving next to you on the road with the very engine that can stall at any second. Social events. Stay tuned. In the next few minutes, you will learn the truth about the crisis, which can forever change not only the future of General Motors, but also the car market as a whole. The GM engine crisis began not with loud headlines, but with whispers in service areas and complaints on owners' forums. The first signals appeared in early 2022, when several dealers in Texas and Michigan reported strange engine failures in the brand new Silverado and Tahoe. At the time, it seemed like an accident, they say, isolated assembly defects or operational errors. But soon, the statistics became inexorable. Cars with a mileage of 8,000 to 12,000 miles ended up on tow trucks with their engines turned off, and the diagnostics showed the same thing: the destruction of the connecting rod liners and damage to the crankshaft. The owners couldn't believe what was happening. Some took out loans for decades to afford a long-awaited pickup truck, while others spent their last savings for a family SUV. And instead of a reliable iron heart, they received a time bomb. One such case occurred in Oklahoma. A family of 4 was returning home from their son's football game when the engine of their Suburban shut down at 65 miles per hour. The car miraculously managed to stay in the lane, but the oncoming traffic passed just a few meters away. The repair cost $14,800, and this despite the fact that the mileage did not exceed 11,000 miles. GM initially tried to gloss over the problem. Internal documents leaked to journalists show that the company already had a list of 47 incidents classified as potentially dangerous in the spring of 2022, but it wasn't until the summer of 2023 that they officially started talking about the massive problem, when it became clear that the flow of complaints could not be stopped. That's when the recall of almost 600,000 cars was announced. The wording sounded dry: preventive check of engine components. However, the reality was that the motors could fail at any moment. without warning. And what is especially striking is that among the affected cars were those that were still standing in dealer parking lots. Several sources reported cases where new Tahoe and Yukon, not even registered with buyers, refused to start due to damage in the cylinder block. In one of the dealerships in Kansas, workers allegedly discovered that 3 out of 10 cars that came to the party already had defective engines. This information has not been officially confirmed, but it has added fuel to the rumors and increased customer distrust. GM's press service assured that the failure rate is extremely low compared to the total production volume. But for the real owners, the dry statistics didn't matter. Communities of dissatisfied people grew on social networks, where dozens of photos of damaged pallets and crankshafts formed an intimidating picture. The first conspiracy theories also appeared there. Allegedly, GM knew about the weaknesses of the design 5 years ago, but chose to ignore the problem in order to comply with new environmental regulations. This version looked plausible because the engines were actually developed under severe pressure on fuel economy. Thin oil channels, reduced clearances, and the use of lightweight materials. All this made the engine more economical and more powerful, but left a minimal margin of safety. According to some engineers who were allowed to participate in the project, the motors could withstand loads in laboratory tests, but real-world operation quickly revealed their vulnerability. As a result, the first point of the crisis turned out to be obvious. Tens of thousands of owners who trusted their safety to a brand with a century-old history faced disaster where no one expected it. New cars worth tens of thousands of dollars broke down in a matter of months. GM threw up their hands, services were drowning in orders, and GM, trying to save its reputation, took a step that only confirmed the seriousness of the problem. A massive recall, an admission that it was not about accidents, but about a systemic failure. The causes of massive breakdowns of GM V8 engines turned out to be much deeper than the dry wording malfunction of connecting rod liners. At first glance, it seemed that we were talking about a series of unsuccessful batches of parts or accidental errors in production. But as independent mechanics and engineers began to take apart the broken engines piece by piece, the picture began to take on a much more disturbing shape. The damage was repeated with frightening accuracy. Worn connecting rod liners, raised crankshaft surfaces, metal shavings in the lubrication system. It wasn't chaos, but a pattern. The main problem was that GM's modern V8s were designed to the limit of what was possible. In pursuit of fuel efficiency, engineers have reduced the gaps between the parts to a minimum to reduce internal losses. Theoretically, this provided a gain of several % of fuel consumption, which allowed the company to comply with strict federal regulations. But in reality, this design left too little room for error. Even a short-term drop in oil pressure or the slightest deterioration in its quality turned into a verdict for the engine. The choice of materials is also worth mentioning here. Unlike the old cast-iron tanks, the new engines received lightweight components, aluminum alloys, thinner connecting rods, and inserts made of cheap composites. In theory, they passed factory tests, but in real-world operation, especially when towing trailers or driving in hot climates, the safety margin was rapidly melting. Several engineers who wished to remain anonymous claimed that during tests at a closed center in Arizona, the engines had already failed at 20,000 miles, but these data were allegedly excluded from official reports. An additional factor was the oil. GM has certified the engines for the use of ultrafine 0W20 synthetics. This made it possible to reduce friction and show beautiful fuel economy figures. But the thin oil film proved unable to stably withstand enormous loads, especially in severe conditions. When the company later began recommending the switch to 0W40, many experts took this as an indirect admission of error. After all, if the engine cannot run on the oil for which it was originally designed, then the design itself is imperfect. Experiments with a new type of oil pumps, hidden from the general public, also aggravated the situation. In pursuit of compactness and cost savings, GM has introduced modified variable capacity pumps. On paper, they saved up to 2% of fuel, but in reality, they caused pressure surges in the lubrication system. According to one former employee of the Tennessee plant, defects were regularly recorded on the assembly line when the pump produced critically low pressure already during running in. However, the batch went into production anyway because the delivery time did not allow the line to be stopped. It is also interesting that in some independent workshops, cracks began to be found in the cylinder blocks next to the oil channels. These cracks could lead to pressure leaks and local oil starvation. Officially, GM calls such cases isolated and related to overheating due to improper operation. But too often they coincided with the picture of the destroyed connecting rod liners to write off everything as an accident. As a result, the combination of several factors at once, extremely thin tolerances, lightweight parts, controversial pumps, and excessively liquid oil, turned into a perfect storm. Cars created for the sake of beautiful figures in fuel consumption reports actually turned out to be vulnerable to what previously seemed unthinkable for the legendary V8s. And if the old engines could survive hundreds of thousands of miles without major repairs, then the new ones began to give up already in the first tens of thousands. But perhaps the most disturbing thing is something else. More and more experts are inclined to believe that this is not an accidental mistake, but a natural result of the corporate policy of recent years. In an effort to meet regulations and maintain leadership in the full-size pickup segment, GM has deliberately compromised on durability. And this compromise turned into a disaster. When the first massive engine failures began to get into the press and were discussed on forums, it was expected that General Motors would come out to the public with a clear and transparent action plan. But the reality turned out to be different. The company's response was more like a protracted defense than a decisive offensive. Instead of acknowledging the existence of a systemic problem and offering a radical solution, the owners were given recommendations that looked like temporary crutches. One of the first steps was to tacitly instruct dealers to recommend a thicker 0W40 oil, which was supposed to compensate for the weakness of the design and reduce the risk of scuffing. But this measure was not immediately issued in an official bulletin. On the contrary, many owners found out about it only after scandals in the services, when the mechanic spoke in a whisper. "Try this oil, so at least your engine will last longer." For customers who paid $67,000 for new cars, this advice sounded like a mockery. The company tried to keep the situation under control through limited service campaigns. Letters were sent in some regions stating that maintenance recommendations needed to be updated. At the same time, the word defect itself was not used in the documents. Dealers were under pressure. They had to convince customers that the problem was minor and that the company was taking preventive measures. But there was panic on the sidelines of the service centers. Engine supplies for warranty replacements were running out a few weeks after the start of the campaign. At one center in Iowa, managers were forced to set a waiting list for new engines, and by the end of 2023, the queue stretched for almost 4 months. Customers were left without their cars, and the replacement vehicles provided were sorely lacking. The situation with the dealers has become a real nightmare. Those who a year ago were selling SUVs and pickups faster than they could unload them from car carriers now saw empty halls and wary glances from customers. Rumors spread faster than official press releases. People came to the showroom and the first thing they asked was, "Are these engines breaking down anymore?" Sales began to fall like an avalanche. To somehow revive interest, dealers doubled discounts, offered free service for several years, and included insurance in the price. But it all worked poorly. The reputational blow was too strong. It was especially difficult for small regional dealers, where pickups were the backbone of the business. In small towns in Oklahoma or Nebraska, up to 80% of revenue came from sales of Silverado and Sierra. Now people have started to look towards Ford and Ram. In some salons, sales dropped by 30–40%, and this jeopardized not only the salaries of employees, but also the very existence of the business. In backstage conversations, the owners of dealer networks admitted that they had not seen such a level of distrust in recent decades. And in parallel with this pressure, the legal machine began to unwind in showrooms and services. The first class action lawsuits were filed in mid-2023, and by winter their number had increased several times. The lawsuits concerned not only the cost of repairs, but also the loss of value of the cars themselves. The owners argued that even if the engine is replaced under warranty, the car still loses value on the market because the stigma of a defective series remains. The lawyers based their arguments on the fact that the company knew about the weaknesses of the design, but deliberately hid the information, limiting itself to cosmetic oil tips. In one of the lawsuits filed in California, internal letters from engineers were presented as evidence, which explicitly stated an unacceptably high risk of failure. These documents, according to lawyers, got to them through a former employee of the testing department. If this information is confirmed in court, GM could face not only multi-million-dollar compensation, but also charges of violating safety requirements. The legal struggle was accompanied by an information war. Leaks appeared in the media about meetings of GM executives with representatives of regulators, about closed meetings where possible fines and ways to minimize the consequences were discussed. Corporate lawyers were betting that most owners would limit themselves to compensating for repairs and would not go further. But people's attitudes were changing. Entire communities grew on forums and social networks, where drivers shared stories of failures, posted photos of destroyed liners, and joined together in search of collective action. For the company, all this resulted in direct financial losses. Each warranty engine replacement cost $12,000–$15,000 and sometimes more if the damage affected the transmission or electronics. In hundreds and thousands of cases, the costs grew rapidly, but the indirect losses were even greater. Investors started to get nervous, and GM shares went down on the stock exchange. In a few months, the capitalization has decreased by billions. Analysts pointed out that the problem is not only in the cost of reviews, but also in a strategic threat. Falling confidence in the segment of full-size pickups and SUVs undermines the company's most profitable business. The legal front was reinforced by pressure from regulators. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has begun checking reports of sudden engine failures on the move. If it is proven that the company was aware of the problems and did not report them on time, fines comparable to multi-million-dollar amounts will follow. There were even forecasts in the media that GM's total costs of the crisis could reach $5 billion in the coming years, taking into account court payments, warranty repairs, and a drop in market share. And all this was accompanied by a moral blow to the very heart of the brand. GM has marketed its V8s for decades as a symbol of reliability and strength. For the buyers, it wasn't just hardware under the hood, it was part of their identity. People were proud that their families had been driving Chevrolet or GMC for generations, and now the same company was trying to convince them that it was enough to change the oil to forget about the problems. Such behavior was perceived as betrayal. The global impact of the V8 crisis turned out to be much bigger than just falling sales and lawsuits. He hit the foundation of trust on which General Motors' reputation has been built for decades. For many Americans, these engines were a symbol not only of reliability, but also of national pride. But now thousands of owners across the country feel cheated, and their personal stories of engines crashing on the move have become viral content, spreading faster than any official company statements. One video from Arizona where a driver shows a completely destroyed cylinder block on a car with a mileage of only 9,000 miles has collected almost 5 million views in a week. And this is just part of the avalanche of user-generated content that is shaping a new brand perception. The crisis did not remain inside the United States. The same engines were supplied to Canada, Australia, the Middle East, and South America. And if in America customer loyalty was somehow based on habit and family traditions, then in international markets everything turned out to be much tougher. In Australia, several large taxi fleets have abandoned purchases of Chevrolet Tahoe. In Dubai, a popular blogger published an investigation into GM's alleged knowledge of the engine's weaknesses, and the video has garnered millions of views among local car enthusiasts. Sales in the region dropped by 27% in just one quarter, and competitors like the Nissan Patrol and Toyota Land Cruiser instantly took over. There is talk in corporate circles that the V8 crisis is not just a local problem, but a threat to GM's entire strategy to maintain leadership in the truck and SUV market. Internal documents leaked to journalists describe 3 scenarios. The first is a large-scale modernization of the engines with new materials and increased clearances. But this will require at least 2 years and billions of dollars in investments. The second is an accelerated shift away from traditional V8s towards hybrids and electric models, which may seem like a step forward, but in fact risks finally losing a conservative buyer for whom the sound and power of the V8 are part of their lifestyle. The third option sounds even more radical: the actual abandonment of part of the segment and a bet on crossovers and electric cars, with the transfer of the pickup niche to competitors. But such a move would mean the loss of GM's main source of profit. The bottom line is clear: the engine crisis has gone far beyond the service boxes. It has become a global challenge for the entire corporation. Now, it's not just about repairs and lawsuits, but about the fate of a symbol of the American automotive industry. GM is faced with a choice: admit mistakes, radically change its approach to quality and regain trust, or finally lose a generation of customers for whom the word reliability will cease to be associated with American V8. The question is no longer whether the motor can withstand the load. The question is whether the company itself can withstand the pressure, which is only getting stronger every day.